Laughter echoed through the mahogany courtroom, cruel and cutting. A wealthy family sat smirking at the black man in the defendant's chair, convinced they had destroyed his life forever. They thought he was an easy target, a convenient scapegoat for their own greedy sins. They were dead wrong. Superior Court Judge Harrison Gable presided over a room thick with tension and suffocating privilege. On one side of the aisle sat the gallery, heavily populated by the elite social circles of the city. They wore tailored suits, designer dresses, and expressions of barely concealed amusement. In their eyes, the trial was merely a formality, an entertaining afternoon spectacle before their evening galas. At the center of their collective scorn sat Augustin Reed. Augustin was a man of quiet, unyielding dignity. At 42, he had fought tooth and nail for every accolade to his name. Rising from a cramped apartment in the city's south side, he had earned a master's degree in forensic accounting and clawed his way to the position of chief financial officer at Kensington Global, a massive logistics empire. For 8 years, Augustin had been the quiet engine keeping the company afloat, plugging the financial holes created by the sheer incompetence of its inheritors. Now he was facing 20 years in federal prison, accused of embezzling over $4 million from the very people he had tried to save. Across the room sat Charles and Beatrice Kensington. Charles, a man whose inherited wealth had shielded him from the consequences of his own mediocrity, leaned back in his chair with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Beatrice, his wife, sat beside him, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of the betrayed matriarch to perfection. Whenever Augustin's defense attorney, Claire Sterling, raised an objection, Charles would lean over and whisper something to his wealthy friends in the front row, prompting a chorus of stifled giggles. They were laughing at Augustin. They looked at his dark skin, his impeccably tailored but unassuming suit, and his calm demeanor, and they saw a man who had forgotten his place. In their narrative, the hired help had gotten greedy, tried to steal from his betters, and was now facing the righteous wrath of the justice system. Prosecutor Richard Montgomery paced in front of the jury box. Montgomery was a theatrical bulldog of a lawyer, a man who built his political aspirations on high-profile convictions. He loved the camera, and he loved a jury that was already eating out of the palm of his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Montgomery began, his voice dipping into a practiced, sorrowful baritone. "Betrayal is a bitter pill, but when that betrayal comes from someone you treated like family, it is a devastating poison. The Kensingtons opened their doors to Augustin Reed. They gave him a 6-figure salary, a corner office, and their absolute trust. And how did he repay them?" Montgomery spun on his heel, pointing a dramatic, accusatory finger directly at Augustin. "He bled them dry. Month by month, year by year. He funneled millions into offshore accounts, falsified ledgers, and covered his tracks with the arrogance of a man who thought he was smarter than the law. We will show you the documents. We will show you the forged signatures. We will show you exactly how Augustin Reed exploited a family's kindness to fund his own secret, lavish lifestyle." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. A woman in a pearl necklace shook her head in exaggerated disgust. Charles Kensington smirked, locking eyes with Augustin for a brief moment. Charles's eyes were cold, filled with the triumphant malice of a man who knew the game was rigged in his favor. Augustin did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply stared back, his expression entirely unreadable. "How are you holding up?" Claire Sterling whispered, leaning close to her client. Claire was sharp, analytical, and severely underestimated by the Old Boys Club of the local bar association. "Let them laugh, Claire," Augustin replied, his voice barely above a breath. "Pride always comes before the fall. Just stick to the timeline." "Montgomery is painting you as a mastermind thief," Claire noted, scribbling furiously on her legal pad. "The jury is buying the betrayed family angle. We need to shatter Beatrice's credibility today." "We will," Augustin said softly, his eyes shifting to the thick, leather briefcase resting at his feet. "Because Charles and Beatrice forgot one very important detail when they set me up. And what's that? Augustin finally allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch the corners of his mouth. I'm an accountant. I never delete a receipt. Judge Gable banged his gavel, silencing the whispers in the gallery. Mr. Montgomery, call your first witness. The prosecution calls Beatrice Kensington to the stand, Montgomery announced grandly. As Beatrice walked past the defense table, she shot Augustin a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. The courtroom held its breath, ready for the tragic tale of the wealthy victim. The trap was set. The Kensingtons were ready to close the jaws around Augustin's life. But they had no idea that they were walking blindfolded into a minefield. Beatrice Kensington took the oath with the practiced grace of a seasoned stage actress. She sat straight-backed in the witness box, adjusting the lapels of her conservative cream-colored blazer. She looked exactly as her PR team had instructed her to look. Wealthy but modest, victimized but resilient. Prosecutor Montgomery approached the podium with a gentle, sympathetic smile. Mrs. Kensington, thank you for being here. I know this is incredibly difficult for you and your family. It is, Beatrice said, her voice trembling just enough to be captured by the courtroom microphones. It's heartbreaking, really. Please, tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant, Augustin Reed. Augustin was. We thought of him as a godsend, Beatrice began, looking earnestly toward the jury box. When my father-in-law passed away, Charles and I were overwhelmed. The company was so massive. We brought Augustin in to manage the finances. We gave him total autonomy. We invited him to our home for Christmas dinners. We trusted him with the legacy of our family. Montgomery nodded slowly, pacing back and forth. And when did you first notice that something was wrong? About a year ago, she sighed, touching her handkerchief to the corner of her eye. Charles noticed that our philanthropic fund, a charity dedicated to underprivileged children in the city, was severely depleted. When we asked Augustin about it, he became incredibly defensive. He said it was just a clerical error due to market fluctuations. Did you believe him? We wanted to, Beatrice said, her voice cracking. But then we hired an independent auditor, and the truth came out. Augustin had been creating dummy vendors. He was writing checks to companies that didn't exist, cashing them, and moving the money into a private account in the Cayman Islands. Millions of dollars, Mr. Montgomery. Money meant for starving children. Stolen to line his own pockets. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. The jury members exchanged darkened glances, their faces hardening as they looked toward Augustin. Montgomery spent the next 45 minutes walking Beatrice through a series of complex financial documents. He showed the court bank statements, wire transfers, and internal memos bearing Augustin's digital signature, authorizing the movement of funds into an entity called Crestfall Holdings. No further questions, Your Honor, Montgomery concluded, casting a triumphant look at the defense table. The gallery practically hummed with satisfaction. The black defendant was cornered. It was an open and shut case. Cross-examination, Miss Sterling? Judge Gable asked. Claire Sterling stood up, slowly. She didn't possess Montgomery's booming theatricality, but she had a surgical precision that made her terrifying in a courtroom. She walked to the center of the floor, holding a single, slim, manila folder. Good morning, Mrs. Kensington, Claire said smoothly. Good morning, Beatrice replied, her tone instantly cooling. You testified that you gave my client, Mr. Reed, total autonomy over the finances of Kensington Global. Is that correct? Yes. We trusted him completely. You trusted him so completely that neither you nor your husband, the CEO, ever reviewed the quarterly financial statements? You never signed off on large expenditures? Beatrice lifted her chin defiantly. As I said, Augustin handled the day-to-day. We were focused on the macro vision of the company. The macro vision, Claire repeated, nodding thoughtfully. Let's talk about that vision, and let's talk about Crestfall Holdings. You testified earlier that this was a shell company, created by Augustin to hide stolen money. You recognized the name of this company, didn't you? Only from the auditor's report, Beatrice stated firmly. I had never heard of it before. "Are you absolutely certain about that, Mrs. Kensington?" Claire asked, taking a step closer to the witness box. "Because you are under oath." "Objection!" Montgomery barked. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Overruled," Judge Gable said. "The witness will answer." "I am certain," Beatrice said, narrowing her eyes at Claire. "I do not know anything about Crestfall Holdings, other than the fact that your client used it to rob my family." Claire opened her manila folder. She pulled out a laminated document and handed it to the bailiff to present to the judge and the prosecution, before handing a copy to Beatrice. "Mrs. Kensington, do you recognize this document?" Beatrice looked down at the paper. For a split second, the color drained entirely from her face. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the edges of the page. The confident, victimized facade slipped, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. I don't," Beatrice stammered. "Let the record show that the witness is examining Defense Exhibit D," Claire said, her voice ringing loud and clear across the silent room. "Mrs. Kensington, this is a certificate of incorporation for Crestfall Holdings, filed in the Cayman Islands 5 years ago. Could you please read the name of the primary beneficiary listed on the second page?" Beatrice swallowed hard. She looked toward the gallery, locking eyes with her husband. Charles was suddenly sitting bolt upright, the smirk completely wiped from his face. "Mrs. Kensington," Claire pressed, her tone sharpening. "Read the name on the document." "It says, Beatrice Kensington," she whispered. The courtroom erupted. The smug laughter from the gallery instantly vanished. Replaced by a chaotic storm of gasps and frantic whispering, Judge Gable slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in this court!" the judge roared. Montgomery leaped to his feet, his face flushed red. "Objection, Your Honor. This document was not in the original discovery." "Yes, it was, Mr. Montgomery," Claire countered calmly. "It was buried in the 4,000 pages of auxiliary financial records your office dumped on us last week. Perhaps if you had read your own evidence, you wouldn't be surprised." Judge Gable adjusted his glasses, looking at the document. "The objection is overruled. Miss Sterling, you may proceed." Claire turned back to Beatrice, who was now gripping the edges of the witness stand as if the floor was dropping out beneath her. "Mrs. Kensington, you just swore under oath that you had never heard of the shell company where the stolen money was hidden. Yet, your name is listed as the primary beneficiary. How do you explain that?" "Augustin must have forged it," Beatrice cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. "He set it up in my name to frame me. He's a liar and a thief." "He forged your signature?" Claire asked. She walked back to the defense table and picked up a heavy, bound ledger. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce Defense Exhibit E." A series of private emails between Beatrice Kensington, Charles Kensington, and a real estate broker in Monaco, discussing the purchase of a $12 million yacht, funded entirely by wire transfers from Crestfall Holdings. Claire dropped the ledger onto the podium with a resounding thud. "Mrs. Kensington," Claire said, her voice dripping with lethal calm. "Did Augustin Reed also forge the emails where you complained that the yacht's interior wasn't the right shade of ivory?" The silence that followed was deafening. The trap hadn't been set for Augustin. It had been set for the Kensingtons, and the jaws had just snapped shut. Chaos reigned in the courtroom for a full 3 minutes. Judge Harrison Gable slammed his gavel repeatedly, his face flushed with irritation, until the gallery finally settled into a stunned, breathless silence. Beatrice Kensington remained frozen in the witness stand, her pale hands clutching the polished wood. The illusion of the grieving, betrayed philanthropist had vanished, replaced by the terrified stare of a woman caught in a lie of staggering proportions. Prosecutor Richard Montgomery stood frozen at his table. He looked down at his own notes, then at Beatrice, realizing with sickening clarity that his star witness had just committed perjury on the stand. "Mrs. Kensington," Claire Sterling said, her voice cutting through the lingering tension like a blade. "I will ask you one more time, and I remind you of the penalties for perjury in this state. Did Augustin Reed forge the emails regarding the yacht purchase in Monaco?" Beatrice looked desperately at Montgomery, but the prosecutor slowly sank into his chair, unable to offer a lifeline. She looked at her husband, Charles, who was glaring at her with a mixture of fury and panic. "No," Beatrice finally whispered, her voice trembling. "He didn't forge them." "So you were aware of Crestfall Holdings?" Claire pressed. "Yes," she choked out. "And you were aware that the funds flowing into Crestfall Holdings were siphoned directly from Kensington Global's corporate accounts and the charitable foundation?" Charles said. "He said it was our money anyway," Beatrice blurted out, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. "He said the company was ours, the charity was ours, and it was just a tax strategy. We didn't steal it. We own it." A collective groan echoed from the jury box. A man in the front row, who had been laughing at Augustin just an hour prior, now shook his head in disgust. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor," Claire said smoothly, returning to the defense table. She sat down next to Augustin, who remained as composed and stoic as a mountain. "Mr. Montgomery, do you have any redirect?" Judge Gable asked, his voice cold. "No, Your Honor." "The prosecution rests," Montgomery muttered, knowing his case had just sustained a mortal wound. "Very well. Miss Sterling, you may call your first witness." Claire stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. "The defense calls Augustin Reed to the stand." The murmurs in the gallery flared up again. It was a massive risk for a defendant in a high-profile financial fraud case to testify, but Augustin walked to the witness box with the calm, measured steps of a man who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took his seat. "Mr. Reed," Claire began, standing by the jury box, "you have heard the testimony today. You have been accused of masterminding a $4 million embezzlement scheme. Did you steal money from Kensington Global?" "I did not," Augustin replied. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely devoid of the nervous tremors that had plagued Beatrice. "Then who did?" "Charles and Beatrice Kensington," Augustin stated simply. "Explain to the court how this happened," Claire instructed. "You were the chief financial officer. How could millions of dollars go missing without you stopping it?" Augustin adjusted his microphone. "I was the CFO in title, but not in ultimate authority. 6 months into my tenure, Charles Kensington implemented a dual authorization protocol for any transfer over $50,000. He claimed it was a security measure. In reality, it gave him the power to push through expenditures without my final approval, provided he used the administrative overrides tied to his IP address." "And did you notice these unauthorized transfers?" "Immediately," Augustin said. 18 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in the quarterly ledger. Massive payments were being made to offshore logistical consultants that did not exist in our corporate directory. When I brought this to Charles Kensington's attention, he told me it was a classified expansion project. When I dug deeper, I found that the funds were routing to the Cayman Islands. "Why didn't you go to the board of directors?" Claire asked. Augustin looked directly at the jury. The board of directors consists of Charles's uncle, Beatrice's brother, and 3 college friends of the Kensington family. When I flagged the anomalies, I was called into a private meeting with Charles. He explicitly told me that if I pushed the issue, he would frame me for the missing funds. He told me that I was just the accountant, that nobody would believe a black man from the South Side over a Kensington, and that he would bury me in litigation until I was bankrupt. The courtroom was utterly silent. The raw, ugly truth hung in the air, stripping away the veneer of high society and exposing the naked arrogance beneath. "So, what did you do, Mr. Reed?" "I did my job," Augustin said. "I am an accountant. I track numbers. I track data. I knew I couldn't stop them internally, and I knew going to the police with a suspicion would trigger their lawyers to destroy the evidence. So, I let them think they had won. I let them continue the transfers. But every single time Charles Kensington bypassed my system to wire stolen money, I initiated a shadow audit." Claire walked to her table and picked up a thick, bound document, handing it to the judge and then to Montgomery. "Defense Exhibit F, Your Honor," Claire announced. "A comprehensive, encrypted digital log. Mr. Reed, "What is in this log?" Claire asked. "It contains the metadata, IP addresses, and MAC addresses for every single fraudulent transaction," Augustin explained, his eyes locking onto Charles in the gallery. "It proves that the transfers to Crestfall Holdings were not initiated from my office computer. They were initiated from the IP address registered to Charles Kensington's private residence, his personal smartphone, and, on 3 occasions, from the Wi-Fi network of the Kensington Country Club." The color drained entirely from Charles Kensington's face. He slouched in his chair, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. The arrogant smirk that had defined his presence in the courtroom was gone, replaced by the visceral terror of a trapped animal. Montgomery stood up, his face a mask of desperate damage control. "Objection, Your Honor. This metadata is highly technical and has not been verified by an independent cybercrimes unit." "It has, actually," Claire interjected calmly. She handed another piece of paper to the bailiff. "Defense Exhibit G, a sworn affidavit from Director Thomas Riker of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, authenticating the digital logs Mr. Reed submitted to their field office 3 weeks before this trial began." Judge Gable's eyebrows shot up. He looked at Montgomery. "The FBI already has this, Counselor?" Montgomery looked as though he had been struck by lightning. He turned to the Kensingtons, his expression souring into one of absolute betrayal. He had been played. The wealthy family had handed him a poisoned chalice, using him to unwittingly prosecute an innocent man while committing federal crimes themselves. "Objection overruled," Judge Gable said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Proceed, Miss Sterling." "Mr. Reed," Claire said, leaning against the podium, "if you submitted this evidence to the FBI weeks ago, why did you allow this trial to proceed? Why endure this public humiliation?" Augustin looked around the room. He looked at the gallery, filled with the city's elite who had come to watch his ruin. He looked at the jury, who were now hanging on his every word. "Because of how this game is played," Augustin said, his voice echoing with a quiet, undeniable power. "If I handed the evidence to the FBI quietly, Charles Kensington would have hired a dozen fixers. He would have paid a fine, settled out of court, and claimed it was a corporate misunderstanding. He would have ruined my reputation in the industry through whispers and blacklisting. I needed him to testify. I needed Beatrice to testify. I needed them to put their lies on the public record, under oath, in a court of law." Augustin paused, letting the weight of his strategy sink in. He hadn't just defended himself. He had orchestrated a masterclass in legal judo, using the Kensingtons' own arrogance and momentum to throw them onto their own sword. "I needed the world to see exactly who they are," Augustin finished. "Your witness," Claire said, sitting down with a satisfied sigh. Montgomery slowly walked to the podium for cross-examination. He had no case left. His star witness had committed perjury. The defendant had FBI-authenticated proof of innocence. The only thing left to do was try to save his own political career from the burning wreckage. "Mr. Reed," Montgomery started, his booming voice reduced to a cautious murmur, "you admit to actively deceiving your employers by running these shadow audits?" Before Augustin could answer, a loud scrape of wood against marble interrupted the proceedings. Charles Kensington had leaped to his feet in the gallery. His face was purple with rage, the veins bulging in his neck. The illusion of the sophisticated aristocrat had entirely fractured. "You ungrateful bastard," Charles screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Augustin. "We gave you everything. You were nothing before I hired you. You're just a glorified bookkeeper. You think you can destroy my family? I own this city. I own you." "Order!" Judge Gable roared, slamming his gavel with such force the handle cracked. "Bailiffs, restrain that man!" 2 heavy-set bailiffs rushed down the aisle, grabbing Charles by the arms. Charles fought them, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder as he thrashed. "He's a liar!" Charles howled, spit flying from his lips as he was dragged backward. "It was my company. I can do whatever I want with the money. It's mine." He had no right. The courtroom sat in stunned, horrified silence as the heavy oak doors banged shut, cutting off Charles's unhinged screaming. The jury members stared at the closed doors, their expressions ranging from shock to deep, unadulterated disgust. The gallery of socialites, who had laughed at Augustin just a day before, now sat in absolute, humiliating silence, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Judge Gable adjusted his robes, taking a deep, ragged breath to compose himself. He looked over his glasses at Prosecutor Montgomery. "Mr. Montgomery," the judge said softly, "do you have any further questions for this witness?" Montgomery looked at his empty legal pad. He looked at Beatrice Kensington, who was quietly weeping in the front row, entirely abandoned by the husband who had just confessed to the crime in open court. "No, Your Honor," Montgomery said, his voice defeated. "In light of the new evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Augustin Reed." A collective exhale rushed through the courtroom. Claire placed a hand on Augustin's shoulder, squeezing firmly. Augustin did not cheer. He did not gloat. He simply closed his eyes and let out a long, quiet breath. The long nightmare was finally over. "Motion granted," Judge Gable said firmly. "The charges are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Reed, you are a free man." The judge then turned his attention to the empty seat where Charles had been sitting, and then to Beatrice. "Bailiff, please contact the federal marshals. I believe they have a warrant to serve." Augustin stood up from the defendant's chair. He picked up his leather briefcase, buttoned his unassuming suit, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. As he passed the wealthy spectators in the gallery, the same people who had smirked and giggled at his expense, the silence was deafening. No one was laughing anymore. Outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302, a different kind of jury was already assembling. Word of the spectacular implosion of the Kensington trial had leaked from the gallery to the press pool in a matter of minutes. By the time Augustin Reed walked out of the courtroom, a sea of flashes and shouting reporters flooded the marble corridor. Augustin ignored them. He walked with the same steady, measured pace he had maintained for the last 2 years of his waking nightmare. Claire Sterling walked beside him, fiercely blocking the aggressive thrusts of microphones. Behind them, the scene was playing out quite differently. Federal marshals had entered the courtroom through the judge's private chambers. Charles Kensington, still panting heavily from his screaming fit, was violently yanked up from his chair. The sound of cold steel ratcheting around his custom-tailored wrists echoed sharply in the emptying room. "Get your hands off me," Charles hissed, trying to pull away from a towering marshal. "Do you know who I am? I will have your badge." "I will have all of your badges. Call my lawyers." "Your lawyers just resigned, Mr. Kensington," Prosecutor Richard Montgomery said dryly as he packed his briefcase. Montgomery didn't even look up, and I highly suggest you save your breath. "The FBI's White Collar Division is currently executing a raid on your corporate headquarters. They are seizing the servers as we speak." Across the aisle, Beatrice Kensington was sobbing hysterically. Her mascara, previously applied to look like delicate tears of a victim, now ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. A female marshal gently but firmly took her by the arm, reciting her Miranda rights. "Charles, tell them!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Tell them it was your idea. I just signed the papers. I didn't know how much you were taking." "Shut your mouth, Beatrice!" Charles roared back, the veins popping in his neck, the illusion of their impenetrable. Loving marriage shattered instantly. When the pressure was applied, the wealthy couple immediately turned on each other like starving wolves. As the marshals dragged the Kensingtons out into the hallway, the press descended. The very cameras that Beatrice had hoped would document her tragic victimhood were now capturing her public destruction. Flashbulbs illuminated her tear-streaked, terrified face. Charles tried to hide his face behind his handcuffed wrists, a futile gesture that only made him look more guilty. The socialites who had filled the gallery, the men and women who had whispered cruel jokes about Augustin's background and giggled at his expense, were now sprinting down the back stairwells, terrified of being photographed anywhere near the Kensingtons. The toxic disease of their sudden disgrace was highly contagious, and high society was entirely immune to loyalty. Within 24 hours, the house of cards completely collapsed. The Securities and Exchange Commission, that's CEC, froze every single asset tied to the Kensington name. The $12 million yacht in Monaco, the very vessel that had sealed their fate in court, was impounded by international authorities. Their sprawling estate in the Hamptons was padlocked. Karma did not just knock on their door, it kicked the door off its hinges. Augustin, meanwhile, sat quietly in the small, sunlit kitchen of his South Side apartment. He watched the evening news as anchors dissected the scandal of the decade. They detailed how Charles Kensington had inherited a massive logistics empire and nearly destroyed it out of sheer greed, attempting to pin the blame on a brilliant, self-made executive who had caught him red-handed. His phone rang. It was Claire. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice bright with exhaustion and triumph. "I'm watching it right now," Augustin said, taking a sip of black coffee. "The board of directors at Kensington Global held an emergency meeting an hour ago," Claire told him. "They ousted Charles, stripped him of his CEO title, his shares, everything. They are desperate to save the company's stock from completely tanking when the markets open on Monday." "That sounds like their problem, Claire." "It is," she laughed softly. "But they also asked me for your personal phone number. They want to offer you the position of interim CEO, with a massive apology bonus, of course." Augustin looked out his window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought about the sneers in the boardroom, the condescending pats on the back, the way Charles had looked at him and told him he was just a glorified bookkeeper who could easily be crushed. "Tell them no," Augustin said calmly. "Are you sure?" Claire asked. "It's a lot of money, Augustin. It's what you deserve." "I deserve better than cleaning up their mess," Augustin replied. "I'm starting my own firm. Forensic accounting. Corporate audits. There are a lot of Charles Kensingtons out there, Claire, and I know exactly how to catch them." 14 months later, the justice system finally delivered its closing argument. The federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan was swarming with reporters, but this time the atmosphere was entirely devoid of amusement. There were no smirks. There were no giggles from the gallery. The air was heavy with the brutal reality of consequence. Charles and Beatrice Kensington stood before a federal judge, stripped of their designer clothes and their arrogant entitlement. They wore the standard-issue beige jumpsuits of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Charles looked like he had aged 20 years. His hair was entirely gray, his posture slumped, his eyes hollow and defeated. Beatrice looked small, fragile, and utterly broken. The trial had been a bloodbath. Desperate to reduce their own sentences, husband and wife had testified against each other, exposing every ugly, greedy secret of their marriage to the public record. They revealed offshore accounts, tax evasion schemes, and bribery, ensuring that neither would ever see a dime of their former wealth again. Augustin Reed sat in the back row of the gallery. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit, a custom briefcase resting at his feet. He was not there to gloat. He was there for closure. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar entitlement, looked down at the Kensingtons from her bench. "Charles and Beatrice Kensington, you were given every advantage in life," the judge's voice boomed through the silent room. "Wealth, education, and social standing. Instead of using those gifts to build upon the legacy of your family, you used them to steal from your own company, to rob charities meant for underprivileged children, and to maliciously frame an innocent man in an attempt to cover your tracks." Charles closed his eyes, his lip trembling. "The arrogance required to believe you were above the law is staggering," the judge continued. "But the law does not care about your bank accounts. It does not care about your country club memberships. Mr. Kensington, for the charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and perjury, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole." Charles swayed on his feet, letting out a pathetic, suffocated sob. "Mrs. Kensington." The judge turned her fierce gaze to Beatrice. "For your role in the conspiracy and for lying under oath, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison." The gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Bailiff stepped forward, gripping the Kensingtons by their arms. As they were led toward the side door, toward the holding cells and the waiting transport buses, Charles lifted his head. His hollow eyes scanned the gallery until they landed on the back row. He saw Augustin. Augustin did not smile. He did not wave. He simply met Charles's gaze with the cold, unyielding stare of a man who had survived the fire and emerged forged in steel. Charles looked away first, dropping his head in total, absolute shame as the heavy metal door slammed shut behind him. Augustin picked up his briefcase and walked out of the courthouse, stepping into the bright, warm sunlight of the city. Life had changed drastically. Reed and Sterling Legal and Financial Forensics had become the most feared and respected auditing firm on the East Coast. Corporations hired them to root out corruption, knowing that if Augustin Reed found a single misplaced dollar, he would expose the rot without mercy. He was no longer the scapegoat. He was the apex predator of the financial world. He walked down the marble steps, pausing for a moment to breathe in the crisp air. The laughter that had once echoed in his ears, trying to tear him down, was gone forever. In its place was the quiet, undeniable sound of a man who had taken back his life. Justice isn't always blind. Sometimes it just needs the right person to force its eyes open. Augustin's incredible journey proves that the truth always outlasts arrogance, and karma never misses a deadline. If this story of brutal revenge and brilliant strategy kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true crime stories.